It began with a question, one that floated through my mind like the drifting seeds on a quiet morning breeze, the kind of thought that arrives not with noise or fanfare, but as a gentle whisper, a suggestion too soft to ignore and too important to forget. I remember standing in the middle of my virtual garden, the sun casting warm golden rays across the rows of unplanted soil, the breeze tugging softly at the edges of the screen, as if inviting me to think bigger, to dream differently. What if I could make coins without lifting a finger? What if every inch of land, every carefully placed seed, and every small upgrade could work silently behind the scenes, even while I walked away from my screen? What if I could rest, truly rest, while the game continued to turn planting into profit, harvesting into freedom? What if the soil itself carried enough wisdom to grow richer, stronger, more generous, even while I did absolutely nothing? That was the dream, the illusion, maybe the goal, definitely. It was a fantasy shared quietly among players, a hope passed down between those who had tilled the land day and night, searching for the rhythm that would release them from constant clicking and movement. Some would whisper about it in chat late at night when the fields were quiet and the pace of planting had slowed. Others would ask about it cautiously in forums or group threads, always phrasing it like a rumor rather than a request, a way to earn without exhaustion, a way to play without pressure, a passive method, a hands-off miracle. I stood there lost in the thought as around me the world bustled with noise and activity. Players zipped past in upgraded gear, their movements efficient, their routines perfected like clockwork. Some moved so fast it was dizzying, planting, harvesting, replanting, upgrading again, an endless loop of motion that seemed to define what farming success looked like. They wore speed like armor, measured their wins by how quickly their hands could keep up with their ambition, and yet there I was still at the edge of that dream, wondering if there was another way, a quieter way, a smarter way, a way that didn't demand every second of my time and attention, a method of farming that allowed space for stillness, for breathing, for creativity, a method that turned my garden into a living, breathing ecosystem instead of a machine fueled by constant input. Didn't come to me all at once. There was no secret switch, no glowing sign that revealed the path to passive success, but the question stayed with me like a seed planted in my mind. It burrowed into the soil of my thoughts and began to sprout tiny ideas, thoughts of balance, of timing, of letting go. It asked me to trust my instincts, to observe more than I acted, to see my farm not as a battlefield, but as a canvas, one where every placement, every crop, every upgrade told a part of a story that could continue even in my absence. What if I could create a system that moved without me? What if I could choreograph my farm like a dance, setting every step in motion ahead of time so that it played out beautifully even if I left the stage for a while? What if the garden itself could learn to breathe on its own, to cycle through growth and harvest and profit like a wave that never stopped rolling? That became my mission, not just to earn, not just to upgrade, not just to survive the rush of farming, but to build something, a self-sustaining garden, a quiet powerhouse, a space where everything had its place and purpose, where value continued to grow even in the silence. That was the vision, and that was where my story began. I'd seen it before in fragments, a farmer standing still while their fields sparkled with life, their plots blooming and bursting with value while their avatar remained unmoving. I had wandered past players whose farms seemed alive even without them clicking or tapping or guiding each moment. It was like the land had learned to breathe on its own, to cycle through seasons, to whisper wealth into their accounts while they simply existed. And so the idea began to root in my own thoughts. How could I create that? How could I design a system that worked when I wasn't watching? How could I turn a few pieces of land into something that moved like a machine without needing constant attention? I stood at the edge of my plot, squinting at the rows of crops, listening to the wind as if it would speak the answer out loud, and slowly, one idea at a time, the truth began to form. Passive income and grow. A garden is not given, it is grown. It is not found, it is built with care and observation, with patience and pattern. There is no magic switch, there is no cheat code to make it happen overnight. It begins, like all things, with the smallest decision, to think differently, to stop racing and start designing. I looked at my plot not as a farm, but as a living system. Every seed had a rhythm, every crop had a cycle, every tool had a purpose. I began to notice the invisible threads that tied everything together. A seed planted in the right place at the right time could align perfectly with the harvest schedule. A well-positioned upgrade could shave time off an entire row's growth. A loop designed not for speed but for balance could maintain itself long after I stepped away, and so I began building my system from the ground up, slowly, methodically, like a gardener shaping a bonsai tree. I rearranged my rows not just to fit more crops, but to allow for smoother movement. I tested which crops would stay active longer, which ones could handle longer gaps between planting and harvesting. I planted not just for value, but for sustainability. Then I paid attention to the tools, not just which ones worked fastest, but which ones required the least maintenance. I learned to let the land breathe. I stopped clicking wildly and started timing my movements. I began to let go of control, one action at a time, trusting that the systems I had shaped would hold their form. Soon my garden began to change. It no longer relied on constant input. It became a rhythm, a beat that kept playing. Even if I missed a step, I started checking in. Instead of managing each detail, I began to observe rather than obsess, to watch patterns rather than panic about lost seconds. My upgrades began to reflect that new philosophy. Instead of chasing speed, I invested in stability. Instead of pouring everything into flashy machines, I focused on consistency. There came a moment when I stepped away for the first time, just a short break, just a few breaths away from the screen, and when I returned, something beautiful had happened. My garden had moved forward without me. My crops had continued to grow. My tools had kept turning. The field had whispered its reward into my account, as if to say, yes, this is the way. That was when I knew I had crossed a line. I was no longer simply playing, I was farming smart. I had built something that worked for me, not because I forced it to, but because I respected the design. I had created a system where seeds turned into harvests without stress, where time became an ally, not an enemy. It wasn't perfect, it still needed care, it still needed input, but it no longer owned me. I could walk through my farm and admire its balance, not just its output. I could take time to watch the sun shift across the sky, listen to the gentle hum of activity, and know that even when I was gone, even when I rested, my garden continued. And then I realized something even more profound. Passive income was not just about making coins while idle. It was about freedom. It was about creating space to breathe, to enjoy, to appreciate. It was about letting the game serve you instead of you serving the game. It was about designing a life within the land where progress happened without pressure. I began sharing the idea with other players. I saw beginners rushing through their plots. I saw them clicking furiously, planting randomly, upgrading without thought, chasing short bursts of reward. I would walk past and quietly whisper to them in chat, build smarter, not faster. Design before you grind, balance before you burn out. Some listened, some laughed, but those who tried it saw the difference. They started walking instead of running. They started mapping their routes, watching the cycles of their crops, measuring not with numbers, but with feeling. And slowly they too began to experience the joy of passive income, the joy of a garden that worked in harmony with their lives. There is something powerful in knowing your plot is alive, even when you are not. There's something magical about logging in and finding your farm blooming with activity, something peaceful about walking your land like a caretaker rather than a frantic harvester. It all started with one decision: to build with intention, to farm with strategy, to trust the process. And from that decision came a garden that grew not just crops, but peace. So, to anyone standing on that patch of dirt, wondering how to start, wondering how to build a system that works for you, know this passive income is not a shortcut. It is a philosophy. It is a mindset. It is the reward for planning, for patience, and for believing that sometimes the best work is the work you set in motion and let grow on its own. And as you walk through your own garden, watching your systems hum, your crops sway, and your harvests bloom, remember this: you are no longer just a player. You are a designer, a farmer, a quiet architect of something truly powerful, and your garden is listening.